This episode of The History Guy is brought to you by Incogni. On October 16, 1972, a Cessna 310 twin-engine light aircraft went missing en route between Anchorage and Juneau, Alaska. That in itself isn't too surprising. Flying in Alaska is notoriously treacherous, but this particular accident was notable in that two U.S. congressmen were on board. Nick Begich, Alaska's only congressman, and Hale Boggs of Louisiana, the House Majority Leader. And to this day, no sign of the wreckage has ever been found. And in the 5 decades since, the mystery of what happened has only deepened. The loss of Pan-Alaska Airways Cessna 310C deserves to be remembered. You know, let's face it, even if you're careful online, your data is still at risk. There's hundreds of these organizations out there that collect your personal data, usually without you even knowing it, and then they sell it. And the stuff that they commonly collect, well, it's really pretty scary. You know, we've all had it happen. You click a box to get a free newsletter and you start getting spam in your email box. You research a medical condition, you start getting hit with ads for things that you never wanted. And every day it's in the news that another major organization has had a data breach. It's not just your email. Sometimes it can call you on the phone, or even a stranger can get your home address. It's a risk not just to your peace of mind, but also to your finances and your family. There's a lot you can do to protect yourself online, but if you want to fight the data pirates, what you really need is Incogni. Incogni is an organization that's going to figure out which of these companies has your data and enforce your right to ask them to delete your data and protect your privacy. And, you can try to do that yourself if you know who they are and how to get a hold of them, and if you know how to ask, if you know how to deal with their objections, but that's going to take you hundreds of hours, or you could just sign up for Incogni. I signed up for Incogni last September, and wow, my data has been removed from 177 sites. 177, and Incogni has saved me a whopping more than 132 hours of work if I tried to do this myself. And I know that because I can always see what's going on this handy dashboard. So do your peace of mind, your pocketbook, and the people you love a favor, and go to incogni.com/thehistoryguy and use the code thehistoryguy to get 60% off a subscription. That's incogni.com/thehistoryguy. Use the code thehistoryguy to get 60% off, or use the link in the description. You'll be glad you did. Just before 9 a.m. on October 16, 1972, a twin-engine Cessna 310C, operated by a small charter service called Pan-Alaska Airways, registration number N1812H, took off from Anchorage International Airport, bound for the state's capital, Juneau. On board were 2 U.S. congressmen. 40-year-old Democrat Nick Begich was Alaska's only House representative. He was in his first term, having been elected in 1970. The former school superintendent had previously served 8 years in the Alaska State Senate. While the Fairbanks Daily News described him as an immensely popular first-term congressman, both at home and in the U.S. House of Representatives, Politico explained in 2016 that at the time, Begich, a freshman, was locked in a tight race against Republican Don Young. That tight race was the reason that a second congressman was also on board, Louisiana Congressman Hale Boggs. Boggs, father of longtime ABC News correspondent Cokie Roberts, had first been elected to Congress in 1940. At the age of 27, he was, at the time, the youngest member of Congress. He had lost the nomination in 1941 and enlisted in the Navy, ran again successfully in 1946 after the war, and had served for the next 26 years. He was a House Majority Whip between 1962 and 1971 before becoming the Majority Leader in January of 1971. He had traveled to Alaska to assist Begich's re-election bid. The congressmen, along with one of Begich's aides, Russell Brown, were on their way to a campaign fundraiser. The pilot of the 4-seat twin-engine Cessna was 38-year-old Don Johns. Writing in an August 2022 edition of the magazine Plane and Pilot, experienced pilot Isabel Goyer said of Johns, "The pilot, himself a remarkable character, went by the name Don Johns, though that wasn't his original name." Johns, who was 38, had changed his name earlier in his life to distinguish himself from the many thousands of other Don Joneses in the world. Johns owned not only the Cessna twin that he was flying, but also the small charter company, which he had grandly called Pan-Alaska Airways. A National Transportation Safety Board report described Johns as an experienced pilot with a valid air transport certificate. He had logged 17,000 hours of flight time, with 11,900 hours of cross-country time and 10,065 hours of multi-engine time. According to the NTSB, Johns had successfully passed an instrument flight check just 6 days earlier. The Cessna 310 was a C model, built in 1959. The Cessna 310 had gained popularity as the plane used in the popular 1950s TV series Sky King. It has generally been described as sturdy and comfortable, and the vintage model is still popular among aviation enthusiasts. The airplane in Alaska was an early model and so had the distinctive straight tail, and according to the NTSB had a total time of service of 3,177 hours. The report noted that the plane had had a 100-hour inspection on October 15th that had found no outstanding discrepancies. Goyer noted that the plane seemed fine. The evening before, the pilot had flown the light twin-engine Cessna down from Fairbanks just for this flight. Fresh out of its regular 100-hour maintenance check and fully fueled up again in Anchorage for the chartered flight, the 1959 Cessna 310C was in game shape for the planned 575-mile jaunt down to Juneau. The NTSB reported that the plane had enough fuel for 6 hours, plenty enough for the anticipated 3.5-hour flight, and that the employee who had filled the plane saw and heard the aircraft and stated that it appeared and sounded normal. The NTSB reported that at about 9:09, the pilot of November 1812 Hulu established radio communication with the Anchorage FFS, or Flight Service Station. The pilot filed his Visual Flight Rules, or VFR plan. The report states that in response to the specialist's query as to whether he had emergency gear and a locator beacon on board, the pilot replied, affirmative. The FSS specialist then advised the pilot of the current weather reports. The report states, this was the last known communication with the occupants of N1812H. Plane and pilot notes that, fittingly perhaps, the recording of that radio call also has been lost. At 1:15, the U.S. Coast Guard reported the plane overdue and the Air Force diverted an 8C-130 aircraft to commence a search. The NTSB report noted that this effort began one of the most extensive searches for a missing aircraft that has been conducted in recent aviation history. Politico reports that it involved 40 military aircraft, 50 civilian planes, a search grid of 325,000 square miles, and more than 3,600 hours of search time. The Washington Post reported in 2019, over the next 39 days, the Boggs family got regular briefings and photos from spy planes based at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Anchorage. Hunters, boats, and more than 70 airplanes joined in the search, which was the largest in Alaska's history at the time. They found another plane that had been missing for 17 years, but they never recovered the Congressman's aircraft. Plane and pilot writes that the NTSB, in its report on January 31st, 1973, concluded that it didn't have enough evidence to say what caused the disappearance. Not much has changed since then in that regard. The report is still the final word. The Washington Post writes that when the phone rang a few hours later at the Begich household in McLean, Virginia, Alaska Governor Bill Egan was on the line. Begich's wife, Peggy, immediately knew something was wrong. I just had an awful feeling in the pit of my stomach. The disappearance, so close to the election, created a specific problem. Both Boggs and Begich were already on the ballot, and both still might be found. Begich's opponent, Don Young, temporarily suspended his campaign, although he later again began quietly campaigning. The Fairbanks Daily News listed possible scenarios, including that Begich be re-elected and found alive, be re-elected and found dead after the election, and, most confusingly, that Begich be re-elected and never found, which was, in fact, the case. This, the paper reported, would cause the most difficulty for the state. That eventuality would require a family member to petition to have the congressman declared dead. As it happened, both Begich and Boggs won re-election, despite being missing. They are two of the 5 people to have been elected to the U.S. House or Senate after their deaths in U.S. history. After the failure of the search, both were finally declared dead in absentia on December 29th. Special elections were held. Begich's seat was won in the special election by his Republican challenger, and Boggs was replaced by his wife, Lindy. That itself required a stroke of fortune, as there had been talk of the wives accompanying the men on their trip. She told the Post, "We'd both considered it, but she and Lindy Boggs decided that there were just too many responsibilities to attend to in Washington." But the political situation gave rise to conspiracy theories as well. Boggs had famously been both part of the Warren Commission and had disagreed with its conclusions. especially that of the magic bullet that pointed to a single shooter. The mysterious accident is usually included in the list of mysterious deaths that suggest a conspiracy regarding the JFK assassination. And in 2021, journalist John Walczak reported in his podcast Missing in Alaska that not only were there discrepancies in the NTSB report, but that a jailhouse confession in 1994 indicated that the plane had been destroyed by a bomb planted by the mob, but targeting Begich, not Boggs. Goyer writes that without hearing the details, and there are details galore, it sounds like the stuff of tin hats and YouTube rants. But it's supported by a good deal of real evidence, much of it unearthed by journalist John Walczak over the past 7 years and presented in a compelling iHeartRadio podcast called Missing in Alaska. Once you hear the evidence, you'll have a hard time dismissing the theory out of hand. But Boggs' grandson, Stephen Sigmund, was less impressed, writing Walczak's premise for the podcast, a 1994 jailhouse claim by a convicted murderer named Jerry Paisley, who was briefly married to Begich's widow, that the plane was intentionally targeted by mobsters with a bomb, while attention-grabbing, leaves an enormous number of holes. Moreover, it has never been corroborated by anyone else. Goyer, however, offers this perspective. How likely is it that the plane was taken out of the sky by a bomb? Given the tentative evidence turned up by the FBI and subsequent researchers, chiefly Walczak, it's impossible to say, but until some far more convincing evidence emerges, the more likely explanation is the simplest one, that the plane crashed after encountering bad weather. The pilot had filed a Visual Flight Rules plan. Visual Flight Rules, or VFR, is intended for conditions in which the weather is generally clear enough that the pilot can see where they are going. Importantly, Pan-Alaska Airways certification was under Part 135 of Federal Aviation Regulations, and under the 135 rules, the service was restricted to VFR flight unless there were 2 pilots on board. But that day, the NTSB explains, the weather conditions along the proposed route to Juneau were not conducive to flight under visual flight rules. Goyer writes that the plane took off under gray skies and into what was, at best, marginal flying weather. As the blog, interestingly titled The Awful Awesomeness of Life, explains, if commercial pilots refused to fly in marginal weather, though, they would not make money, because the weather is often bad in Alaska. Flying in Alaska can certainly be dangerous. The website Alaska Web writes that the Pilots Association Air Safety Foundation data shows that Alaska's accident rate for smaller general aviation aircraft was more than 2 times higher than the national average. The San Diego Union-Tribune wrote in 2010, more than 80% of Alaska's communities, including the state capital of Juneau, are not connected to highways or road systems, making travel by air or water an essential. The state says Alaska has roughly 1 registered pilot for every 58 residents, and its plane crash rate is much higher than the national average. Alaska Web writes that for many Alaskans, flying hundreds of miles to larger cities for shopping and errands is as common as taxis and buses might be to urban dwellers. And the Union Tribune noted that former U.S. Senator Ted Stevens was so mindful of the risks that he once called plane crashes an occupational hazard for politicians in Alaska. And he spoke from experience. He survived a plane crash in 1978 that killed his wife. That comment included an additional irony. Stevens was killed in a small plane crash in the state in 2010. Again, without the wreckage, it's difficult to determine. Goyer notes that what role the weather played in the loss of N1812H, however, will likely remain a mystery. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that the plane crashed in bad weather, as many hundreds of other planes have crashed over the years in Alaska. Though again, there is no direct evidence to support that theory either. And why was the plane not found? The pilot had claimed that there was an emergency locator on board, but as of October 17th, the NTSB told the Associated Press, so far we haven't heard a squawk out of it. In fact, the NTSB eventually concluded that no locator was on board. The report indicated that a witness had seen an object in the pilot's briefcase that was approximately the size and shape of an ELT, but also noted that the chief pilot's personal ELT was found, after N1812H was reported missing, in the cabin of another Pan-Alaska aircraft at Fairbanks. Plane and pilot speculates that it's likely, though far from certain, that when Johns headed out from Fairbanks the day before the fateful flight, he simply forgot to grab the portable unit from the other airplane and didn't realize it until he was already on his way to Anchorage, or already there. And when he was asked if he had an ELT on board, he did what many pilots would have done in that same circumstance, and fibbed. Despite the lack of locator, however, why was the plane not found in the extensive search? Goyer explains that where did it wind up that it hasn't been found all these years later? The possibilities are endless. Perhaps it crashed into Prince William Sound, sinking into the depths, never to be seen again, or maybe it slammed into a glacier where it was buried in snow and ice. Perhaps it crashed into the side of a mountain and slid down into a steep ravine or high forested section of steep rock. There are so many other scenarios that could have played out to hide the wreckage from history, which makes it no different than many other crashes in Alaskan aviation history in which a plane never showed up somewhere and, despite heroic efforts to find it, was never seen again. And of course, there's still the chance that the wreckage might be found. While he discounted the bomb theory, Boggs' grandson hoped that the work that was done by Walsek might help to narrow down the location of the wreck, and if it could be found, it might finally help to solve a mystery more than 5 decades old. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.